Welcome to the TasFarmers podcast. As always, it's been a big week. There's three big topics to talk about this week. Firstly, the federal budget, what it means for families, family farms, small businesses. There's talk of capital gains, trusts and succession. Secondly, there's been a bit of chatter from the East Coast about the recent Forest Practices Authority fining down there. We've got a bit to talk about in terms of red tape, unclear rules, and whether the current system is actually focused on practical environmental outcomes or punishments. And thirdly, the looming stater budget, where we'll be sending the illustrious Neil Gross down to find out what's happening. And we'll need to talk about what farmers should see from that. But as always, going around the table, sounds like a cable car from Mount Wellington. Nathan Cowman, the man on the political pulse. How are you?
Very good, very good.
Good to have you back.
It's good to be here.
And Mr. El Presidente, Nathan Cox. Good to have you here, Nathan.
Thank you, Grayson.
And our own Neil Gross. Neil, how's the book writing?
It's going well. I'm quite ebullient today. Grayson.
Ebullient?
A word of the day, ebullient.
And the meaning?
Happy.
Happy.
Overjoyed.
And where can I find books? Book sales, where are they being held?
You can find my book at the moment on the printing press of McPherson's in Melbourne.
Fantastic.
But in about the second week in June, you'll be able to find it in all the popular outlets or direct from me.
Yeah, fantastic. Get in touch with Neil. It's all about fly fishing and the good life in Tassie. Is that right?
Yeah, it's more about Tasmania than it is about fly fishing.
Fantastic. Oh, well, first, before we do kick off, we must celebrate a few people. Nathan Cox, National Volunteers Week.
Yes, Grayson. So National Volunteer Week 2026 runs from the 18th to the 24th of May. And this year's theme is Your Year to Volunteer. Recognise the contribution of volunteers and encourages people to get involved. It also aligns with the United Nations declaring 2026 the International Year of Volunteers for Sustainable Development. As we know, volunteers are the engine room of so much of our community, particularly in agriculture. We've only got to look at AgFest and the amount of volunteers we have on committees and councils here at TasFarmers that do a lot of heavy lifting. Plus there's a whole range of other organisations in agriculture where volunteers are key. Women in Ag, Countrymen's Association, there's a whole range of them, and we appreciate our volunteers, and we know that a lot of agricultural support just wouldn't happen without them.
Yeah, SES, fire brigades, sporting organisations, just in rural communities.
I was going to say, and everything that makes rural communities tick, which is where our farmers are, is all based around volunteering, whether it's community houses, footy clubs, netball clubs. The volunteer amber, think about northeast at Scottsdale, there's one permanent ambulance operator, the rest are all volunteers.
Yes, I've met a few of those volunteers on the East Coast as well, playing golf with a father-in-law, but that's a story for another time.
What, you mean you needed an ambulance for playing golf?
Yeah, let's move on real quickly before we have to talk about that. Last week was the federal budget, and the wrap-up has just been quite astonishing on social media. Federal tax changes creating concern for small businesses and family farms. Nathan, you're the man probably to explain the technicalities here. What's our overall reaction, though, to the federal budget? Was it a case of win, lose or draw for farmers?
I think the general feeling from talking to our counterparts in the NFF is that it appears like the federal government did listen around intergenerational assets needing to be treated differently when it comes to succession planning and enabling the family farm to be an ongoing concern around that movement between generations. However, I think there's still quite a bit that needs to be worked through our counterparts in the NFF to make sure that things like the thresholds around when those rules will apply or not apply and how they'll work in practice are actually implemented. So I think there's still a little bit more water to go under the bridge, but it was pleasing to see that the federal government had listened to a degree there. I think more broadly, though, there's, a bit of a groundswell building within the community at the moment around, the Labor Party breaking promises that, it had only made 12 months ago at an election, and that had basically caused it to lose 2 prior federal elections due to not being particularly well received by the voting public. So, I think, there's a lot more ground to play out there, and a lot of conversation, I think, around the fact that is this just a distraction from the government's inability to actually cut back on spending, which is really putting greater pressure on inflation, I think, within the economy. And that inflation probably puts farmers and the broader community at far greater financial risk than any other factor at the moment. So, a complete fail on that regard, I think. However, from a perspective of, looking after farmers during succession planning, some glimmers of hope.
Yeah, the real story would seem to be government spending is certainly creating inflation and causing the inability for the private sector to deliver real growth to the economy. What's the real importance here in terms of the exclusion of income from the minimum tax on discretionary trusts for farmers? Why is it so important? How would we explain it to farmers? What I originally saw was it was probably more the extreme case. So a family passes away, leave a couple of kids. We were then going to suddenly start taxing those kids on any income from the trust at 30%. What's the sort of the application here? So the trust was getting income that would get taxed at a regular rate. There's no there's no money coming. When money comes out of the trust, there's no tax. In this case, the government was now saying we'll put an additional 30%, is that right, on the trust? Mm. And then anyone now receiving income would pay an additional tax based on their income. What does it look like now? Complicated topic.
Yeah, I think, your summary there is fairly accurate, but I think, we've got to often realise that, often there'll be 2 generations working alongside each other during that transition period. And that's why these, we won't call them carve-outs, but exceptions need to be recognised by government to make sure that during that transition period, 2 generations can be working together, and that, there isn't a disadvantage in, that handover happening at an opportune time, so that the farming business becomes a going concern generation to generation, and that the next generation isn't lumbered with a huge capital gains tax bill at the time of, asset transfer. So
there's definitely been a lot of interesting, Nathan Cox, a lot of interesting social media around this. The Silent Partner, a very well-run campaign by, I think it was the Small Business nationally, Small Business Council. What's your take on the Silent Partner, and what does this backlash really mean? What's it a sign of? Is it a sign of wider frustration with the government?
It is. It is a sign of frustration. Frustration of probably not a lot of awareness of consequences of some of these policy positions. And we've got to remember the way the farming business model works. The old adage is that farmers are asset rich and cash poor. Anyone that's been even close to farming will know that farmers turn over a lot of money and they get to keep very little of it for themselves. Their real wealth, or their savings, their super, call it what you like, is in the property. They work all their life to try and build something for themselves or for the next generation, and they've paid a lot of tax on what they've bought along the way, and it's very unfair, and seems very unfair to the small business community, particularly in agriculture, that someone can just reach in and take quite a large chunk of that growth that they've worked all their life for, and held back very little of that money for themselves.
Yeah, you need to remember that money that's left over that they've saved, they've already earned it and paid tax on it once.
Absolutely.
Like that's, if you were to translate that into your average wage earner, that after your 30-odd% comes out, your 70% goes into the bank, and then the government wants to tax you on when you spend it out of the bank again. Like, it's just inherently unfair.
Is it the general level of taxation in Australian society that's bothering people near, or is there something?
I reckon we're reaching the tipping point around redistribution, so that people are increasingly becoming frustrated with government taking more and more, but seeing to deliver less and to deliver it less efficiently. So we see a whole range of programs, and NDIS is a classic one where it has just exploded in the cost to the nation. But we see it typically, just filled with rorts, and that's funded by people's wages. And we talk about farm incomes, but also, the main source of revenue for the Australian government is wage and salary earners. So people, lose 30% before they never see it. It's taken before they see it, and they don't see it being spent wisely or efficiently.
But on capital gains, one side is sort of saying this is fixing a Howard era mistake of offering a discount.
No, but the Howard era, it wasn't a mistake. So John Howard clearly had a clear policy position where he wanted to grow the wealth in Australia. He wanted to grow individuals' wealth. He wanted to reward people taking a risk, working hard, and saving or investing in business or investing in property. So from that point of view, the Howard era policy worked extremely well. It did exactly what it did. What it said it would do. And now there's a whole bunch of people who are saying, well, hang on, we want our share of that. Well, you didn't earn it. You didn't work for it. And that's where the level of frustration is coming from. And I'm just thinking around the politics of this. Going back, someone said the other day on the radio, when governments have to explain, they are losing. And at the moment, governments are explaining a lot of complicated stuff and no one's listening. All they're hearing is more tax, more tax, more tax, government spend, government spend, government spend. And if you think about when people have to explain and they're losing, think about John Hewson and the Fight Back campaign, where he had actually a really simple concept, which was a 10% tax on consumption.
Like cake?
It was meant to be very, very simple. And then he had to start explaining it. And as soon as he started explaining, he was lost. He was buggered because no one wants to know the detail. They just want to know the principle.
Well, how do we all react to the idea of, the capital gains tax, the implications, as someone's alluded to, is now on shares as well. There's a whole heap of probably unintended consequences of it. But broken promises, what's a feeling? It's definitely a promise broken. It feels like only 12 months ago, Albo was saying, no, this is not coming. Definitely a broken promise. Nathan Cox?
I just think the promise that was broken was that they promised to keep their sticky fingers out of capital gains and negative gearing, and we've got quite a few sticky fingers in the jar at the moment.
I'd say farmers aren't really asking for special treatment. They're asking for tax rules that understand, as you say, Nathan Cox, how the family farm actually works. But let's talk of rules. Farmers need clear rules, fair processes and practical support before they're punished with any regulations. And the most recent East Coast case has raised serious concerns among farmers. $100,000 in fines, it's enough to raise anyone's eyebrow. The question is probably not whether environmental rules are needed or should they exist, but it's whether they're clear, fair and practical. Mr. President, are the FPA guidelines clear enough for farmers? If you jump on the website, ring and ask for advice. What's your take on the whole system for the FPA?
No, they're not. They're not clear, and actually, if you just briefly look at the websites that are related to land clearing and conversion and forestry, for farmers, it's actually misleading. When you first look at the websites, there's always a statement that says you can clear a hectare or up to 100 tonnes of timber off your farm every year, annually, without a forest practices plan. You have to keep reading, because that is not the case. They're the first couple of sentences that you'll see. It is not the case. Personally, I've been through 2 forest practices plans in the last couple of years. Very glad I did. The first one was for large-scale conversion from plantation to pasture. Fantastic forest Forest Practices Planner. Made it so easy. The FPA was actually really easy to work with once we started to go through that process. And the second one, we wanted to clear some corridors for wallaby fence, and then with looking at the remnant bush in a couple of places, it was just going to be easy to clear it. I looked at the guidelines. It said a hectare or 100 tonnes. We could have made that work and done a hectare a year over a couple of years and got our corridors and removed the remnant bush. Spoke to a contractor who actually understood, and he said, get a forest practice plan. And I'm glad I did.
How hard and how costly are those plans?
So the first one for the plantation to pasture conversion was done almost completely out of my hands, and that was really simple. The cost of that was covered through royalties from the plantation. I didn't actually see the cost of that. The second one for about 6 hectares of bush to be cleared for wallaby fence and a few other things. First quote was $13,000. Yep. And I'm actually working with another forest practices planner to do it for about 3, which is still a chunk of money, but it allows me to get some really seriously needed wallaby fences in, clear a corridor back from the wallaby fence so I don't lose it to falling trees or limbs. And there's a whole range of things around that too. If you want a corridor, they'll give you up to about 5 metres. But our trees are 20 to 30 metres high, and the limbs will stick 5 to 10 metres out over where the wallaby fence is. So if we get a limb come down or a tree come down in some of those areas, we could get hundreds of wallabies over that broken fence overnight, and we're in trouble.
So for the practicalities of that, why can't you trim the limbs out but leave the trees there?
Because they're about 20 metres up.
Yeah, I know. There's ways
of doing it.
And that might...
We could. Question, absolutely, that could be done, but arborists are horrendously expensive, particularly at that height. But that is actually an option.
If that's over one side's government land, do you feel like it's a fair and equitable system?
Well, if I'm feeding government wallabies, I don't think it's equitable at all, and that's why we need the wallaby fence.
Well, they're all government wallabies, aren't they?
They are, and we're feeding the government's livestock, and that's a conversation for another day.
If you turn them upside down, it's got "Made in Tasmania" written underneath it.
Yeah,
so they're made in the UK.
So the trying to keep wallabies out. Trying to deal with remnant bush, that's an issue. You need a forest practice plan to clear those corridors. There's another issue with the corridors too, where we want corridors for wallaby fences. They can also be fire breaks, and even on places like King or Flinders Island where you don't have the firefighting capacity, fire breaks are critical. And I think we need to look at how the FPA apply some of this so that there's more leeway to create those corridors, one for the wallaby fences and the other is for fire breaks, so that if it is going to be a tough bushfire season, you can run a set of discs up there and get some bare dirt. It's almost a community service to try and create a corridor of bare dirt to stop fire jumping from one property to the other. But without a forest practices plan, you can't clear those corridors.
Well, there's certainly some penalties if you don't go get yourself a plan and talk to the FPA, and my eyes always water when I look at the 100,000 number. Nathan Cowman, should we really be seeing fines go back to the FPA? Because I believe that's the case, that the fines, the provisions in the Act allow for fines to go back to the FPA. Do you think that creates a practical problem, or is it just a perception issue?
Oh, I think it's a genuine conflict when, the judge and juror also collects the prize at the end of the day in terms of fines. I mean, the FPA does need to be funded to do the work that it does do. I mean, the FPA, without it, we wouldn't have a private and public forestry sector within Tasmania, and actually having a framework that, protects those industries is hugely important. But fines, be they for speeding or for anything else in our society, they should go back to, the government as consolidated revenue for it to then reinvest and actually fund other things. Our police force and firefighting services, they're not funded by, fining people for speeding. So this shouldn't be any different. It just creates, an unnecessary view of conflict that, leaves a bad taste in people's mouths.
Nathan, bad taste when you see those sorts of fines.
Very bad taste. And what leaves the bitter aftertaste is it would appear to farmers after, say, this case, that FPA are almost incentivised to go after this level of fine. It goes back into their pocket. They've got reason to go looking for it. It would just look like a racket.
A racket. Neil, any thoughts on this style of racket? This government does seem to rely on an annual revenue line from speeding. Should they be relying on an annual revenue line from environmental clearing practices?
You'd rather see them put their effort into getting a better outcome for farmers and making sure that everything works in the first place rather than fining people. I mean, what are we trying to do here? Better outcome for the environment and for farmers, or a better outcome for the consolidated revenue of the FPA?
Well, the goal should be better environmental outcomes, not just bigger fines.
Well, I think perhaps the goal should be better practical outcomes.
But I'm not sure we should have to have lawyers and consultants at 3 to 10 grand.
Well, they're very important people, but perhaps not in this process.
I just think there's opportunity here, and this is almost hit headline level, this particular case, and in some cases it has, for a review of how FPA works, how it applies to farmers, how their guidelines apply to farmers, how clear and how easy, how costly the system is to use for farmers. These bureaucrats that administer this, they enjoy the fruits of farmers' labour at least 3 times a day, and then sit looking at aerial photographs, satellite imagery, looking for ways to nail them and get some money out of them.
And I mean, when you talk about reviews, I think that reviews, sometimes for government, reviews are the easiest thing to do because it's just another means of kicking it down the road. But there's an opportunity for government, particularly state government, to review a whole range of things with a view of what are these programs actually doing? Are they there to make the good ship of Tasmania go faster and for farmers and foresters to be more efficient, to do the right thing, but ultimately to be better, or is it to catch people out? And it is, without doubt, there are people working within the bureaucracy who have an ideological position where they just want to catch people out. Mm-hmm. And they will do a range of things, and they will modify advice to ministers or for government to do just that because they have a view, and we see it in parks and wildlife where there's a view that they don't want humans in the environment.
I think there's a long-held view as well that, the FPA was established really as a starting point for making sure that native forestry in the state could continue. And it now appears to have become, the overseer for what can happen on private farmland. And talking to a lot of farmers recently, they're really, really frustrated that essentially they're paying more and more council rates for land that they've bought, but essentially now needs to function as a national park. So, that is a huge, huge frustration when farmers, need to be able to generate some sort of return. They want to do that in a way that is environmentally sustainable. However, in this case in question, the landholder didn't do this knowingly. And I think there's a huge opportunity there for the FPA to actually do more and more community education with private landholders, because you can't throw the book at someone if they don't even understand that the rules have changed.
It's just a bureaucratic version of bracket creep. Because I remember when the FPA first came in, as most of us would, during the very controversial years during the forestry wars. My family has been involved in forestry since the first of the wood chipping in the state. And you've just seen this gradual progression of bureaucratic oversight, which in the early days was initially to stop people from pulling logs down creeks and clear felling where they probably shouldn't, and looking after patches of bush for the betterment of the overall environment. Whereas now we're getting wound up in bureaucratic processes about putting in a bloody wallaby wire fence. For goodness sake.
Are there other changes we'd like to see?
Yeah, I mean, this is just another classic example of red tape on red tape, I think, for most producers, or red tape on green tape on red tape. Farmers need to understand clearly what's expected of them, and then, have a set of rules that don't change every 5 minutes, because I think that's what frustrates people more and more.
I reckon there's a new colour of tape coming out, Nathan. It's called grey tape, where we just don't know what we're meant to be doing.
Yeah. You heard it here first, folks.
You heard it here first.
Great tape.
TasFarmers.
I think farmers do a fantastic job of managing the balance between environmental outcomes and economic outcomes for their business. And I don't know of too many people that want to go and clear fell everything, but when areas need to be cleared or changed, there needs to be pathways to do that within reason, and within reasonable pricing patterns.
Well, it still seemed to me that you need a big wallet and perhaps a crystal ball to understand what you can and can't do on your own land. But talking of crystal balls and predictions, our state budget. Tasmania's heading into what could possibly be a tough budget, and farmers will be wanting measures that reduce cost pressures. Those areas would include or be around freight, biosecurity, water, energy, insurance, labour, education and skills. Nathan, you mentioned local government. A tough budget should still bring back industries that create value. Neil, what should we be watching for in the state budget?
We should be looking for a state government that's trying to get the size of government under control. I was thinking about this the other night, and one of my great political heroes is Abraham Lincoln.
Big Abe.
The Big Abe. So he was the American president during the Civil War. And in 1862, he said this thing about the size of the American parliament and the American government was that there were too many piglets for the tits. And I think we need to think about that in the context of the Tasmanian government and the public service, because what we have and what we can afford to do doesn't match up. So revenue doesn't match expenditure. Good business says what comes in needs to be more than what goes out, and we're not in that shape. So alluding to what you spoke about before, the budget should be focusing on what makes Tasmania go forward. So they've got two things to do. The state government, they've got to manage the size of their business and get that into gear. So being $10 billion in debt is just outrageous for a state of 530,000 people, pretty much half of which aren't in the productive workforce. But then it's how does government set the rules so business can do what it needs to do best, which is generate economic activity, growth, employment. And I know people say, your grow business doesn't impact state government coffers, but it does reduce the reliance of people on state government programs where they can stand on their own 2 feet. And we are increasingly getting into a mentality in Australia where we just look for the government to fix everything. And that when we do that, we see governments get bloated and we see government expenditure increase past revenue.
But there should surely be some things, education, health, and perhaps in farming case, biosecurity, which should be properly funded.
Have to get back to first principles. We need to make the Tasmanian economy smarter, more efficient. Agriculture is our number one thing moving forward. There is no other sector of our economy which can drive the state forward than agriculture. When you think about just simply what we grow and what we produce, but also the potential for what we can value add. So as Nathan Cowman always says, there's too much stuff leaving this state that's not value added. Nearly 900,000 lambs a year go across Bass Strait, still on their own 4 feet. We see an enormous amount of vegetable produce leave the state unbranded. We see so much stuff leave here as a commodity rather than a value-added product. That is our future. Governments need to focus on what we can do to build that future, and we see a lot of money being spent on the existing major industrials to try and preserve industries which are either the smallest in the world, the oldest in the world, or most likely the most inefficient in the world, where we really need to cut that umbilical cord and look for what's in the future. So give birth to the baby, which is the future economic growth of Tasmania, rather than just hanging on to what we've got.
So there is a fine balance between cutting and supporting. What does ag need right now? Does it need cheaper insurance?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure whether uninsured or not sure or anything like that's going to help anything. All it does is muddy the waters, and all it does is reduce confidence in people's confidence that the government have the ability to run the place when they come up with things like that. So what we need is a good, solid set of rules that farmers know how to build and how to get on with. The government needs to start stimulating industry which grows the state into the next 5 decades, not what was being growing in the past 5 decades.
Let's go down a little rabbit hole.
Oh, good.
Nathan Cowman.
We like rabbits.
I am interested in the uninsurer of TasInsure. I thought the election promise was driving down costs by offering insurance. Did something change recently in that equation?
Look, reading between the lines, it would appear that the original business case for TasInsure maybe didn't span more than a page of ideas as opposed to the practicalities of implementing a scheme like a state-run insurance scheme. So, but nonetheless, commitments were made around TasInsure that, it was going to reduce small business insurance costs by 20%. And on those grounds and on the information provided, TasFarmers backed that in as a good thing for the farmers across the state. Now, the government's obviously had some more detailed planning go in around, how would you make those commitments come alive? And have changed tact and said that, we will now, implement these things in a different way that we think will maybe even deliver even greater outcomes for households and small business across the state. I guess the question for us is, so when's that going to happen? Because the government's initial commitment was that they would have the initial legislation out within their first 100 days of government, which has happened, and that TasInsure would be up and running and delivering for Tasmanians during 2026. And, we're in May now. So I guess what we just want to see, and I don't think it's too much to ask, is that, we have a clear pathway and vision of, when will Tasmania's small businesses, many of which are farmers, actually see that impact on their bottom line, I think.
And this is the frustrating thing where we talk about high cost of insurance, and all of us see it, and with my other hat in the racing industry, it's just out of control. But insurance premiums are based on risk, and risk is based on what legislative framework creates that risk. So if government really wanted to reduce the insurance burden on Tasmanian businesses and Tasmanians, they would work to A, reduce risk in the environment, so through fire and all those sort of things, but also through legislation, reduce the exposure to risk which businesses have. And there's a whole range of that, whether it's building insurance, whether it's silly things like, the farm dam safety assessments. All of these things compound the insurance cost and the insurance risk. That's the thing which governments could work to fix insurance costs on Tasmanians without going down the brain, the bubble, or whatever you want to call it, of TasInsure, which was a political ploy. I mean, let's face it. I mean, it was the big idea the government had during the election to get across the line. They got across the line with 30-odd%. The opposition had no big idea. So they, and there we are, and here we are.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the big things that we were excited about with TasInsure was, I think, the inclusion of workers' compensation insurance, which we know is one of the biggest ballooning costs for primary producers. A classic example, following what Neil was saying around what government could do without actually running an insurance agency for the state's producers, is actually review the state's workers' compensation legislation, which is something that they are required to do every 10 to 15 years. And we know that during the last Labor Green government, in its final years, they actually did that last review, and we went from probably having a framework that delivered some of the lowest annual premiums for small business to some of the highest. At that point, premiums were probably roughly 6 to 8% of your payroll bill every year. and they probably currently sit for some primary producers somewhere between 15 and 25% of your payroll bill, and that could be changed overnight through meaningful reform that could happen tomorrow. And we're coming up, if not overdue, for that 10-year review that I think all of our upper and lower house politicians should just jump on board with as something that could relieve pressure on, the state's small business community.
That was one of the great reforms of Robin Gray's government. Not that there were that many, but there was a few, but
one to remember.
Yeah. Some for the wrong reasons, but was his review, or that government's review, of the Workers' Compensation Act, which basically started again, and that gave a lot of confidence to business where they knew exactly where it was going, but also provided a lot of protections, sensible protections for employees who were injured in the workplace, which ultimately is what workers' compensation insurance is about. And I think, imagine if we were to reform workers' compensation insurance and reform payroll tax in this state, how much more capital would be freed up by business to employ more people and invest more? Because I reckon employing more people and investing in your business will be better for Tasmania than just pay more insurance premiums or payroll tax.
Yep. Just shifting gears a little bit on the state budget. One of the promises that we were given was no new taxes.
No.
Yeah, and so
what a crazy politician would say.
For me and for a lot of our farmers, looking at the no new taxes, no taxes by stealth, no levies, no secret lifting of registrations. We've already seen that with tractors. I think we've gone from $93 to $206 in just a couple of years.
Channel my inner Ian. That's outrageous.
That's outrageous. But if that was to happen to the average Joe for his
I'd be upset.
Camry, absolutely,
Very upset.
But farmers wear that sort of increase, and if they can do that once, they can do it again. And so no new taxes, but we also need to watch out for no new taxes by stealth, no new taxes called levies or registrations or whatever it is, because that stuff adds up. The government's got their hand in your pocket all the time. It's quite uncomfortable to have it there so often, and we've just got to watch that in this next budget. They're looking for cash, and they'll find it in our pockets.
But this will be a hard budget, and it should be a hard budget, but it should be a lesson for all future governments, which is never heeded, which is don't spend too much money, because we are in this situation because for the last 11 years we have had ice cream for breakfast, and we have just spent far too much money which doesn't have a revenue model to back it up, where we've spent money on all sorts of things which individual communities like, but we're in a position now where we've got no money and we've got to pull it back into gear again simply because we've blown the credit card.
So let's watch for broken promises, but if we just rewind for a moment, this fish of cheaper insurance, was that, let's judge it, did it smell? Was it a broken promise? Do I throw it in the broken promise bucket, or is it a strategic change in direction which will still deliver outcomes? Does anybody wish to place judgment on that?
Do you think it was one of those situations where perhaps government bit off more than they could chew? They went with the Tasmania thing, and then once they got in the government, they realised what a beast they'd created.
So many mixed metaphors there. Like normally when you bite off more than you can chew like buggery, but I think they bit off more than they can chew, and then their teeth fell out. It was a dumb promise in the first place, and they should have backtracked, in my personal view, and they should have backtracked much earlier than now. But we are where we are.
I do like the idea that it was a big policy idea, and the election in some ways could have been about big ideas. But talking of big ideas, let's go from the state's productivity to productive land. The Rushy Rat Pack, FIRB and a few others still taking their time to make judgment. Rushy is probably not just one property. It's become a bit of a symbol for a much bigger issue. Whether Tasmania is serious about protecting productive agricultural land and maintaining transparency around major land use is one thing, but who buys the land is another sort of issue here, and what happens to that land is almost it's important, and I won't say it's secondary, but who's buying this? Who's buying this land? And that's why FIRB is involved. They're making the decision as the Foreign Investment Review Board. TasFarmers is now actively seeking community feedback from the Northeast and the broader community, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. Nathan Cowman, can you remind listeners a little bit more about why Rushy Lagoon is such an important test case for Tasmanian agriculture?
Yeah, so I guess firstly, just as a summary, it's probably the state's largest piece of agricultural land. It's some 22,000 hectares. Most will say that it's vastly underproductive at the moment through lack of investment and vision for what that land could do. And it's been up for sale for some time. And I guess our concern isn't that it could be purchased and converted from dairying, grazing, cropping to agroforestry, but that its sale and conversion is basically occurring through federal government subsidies that are distorting the market and basically pricing out other potential purchasers who have been keen and were keen to invest and bring that land back up to a higher productive standard for traditional agriculture, and do it in a way that really would have brought that region of the state alive again, because there isn't a whole lot of employment opportunities out in that area. And it's that market distortion and the fact that government are hiding behind a third-party investment firm in the UK in doing it and refusing to talk about it, that basically says, if it smells wrong and if it looks wrong, it's got to be wrong, particularly when no one will talk about it. And I think, the current federal government is starting to get a bit of a reputation for, if there's something that they don't want to talk about, but they want to do anyway, they'll just not talk about it. And that does not sit well, I don't think, with the local community. And we've been saying loud and strongly for some time that in making their decision, the Foreign Investment Review Board not should, but must talk to the local government. They must talk to the local community, and they must talk to the body that actually represents the industry that's currently utilising that land, and that would be TasFarmers. And to date, they've basically fobbed us off. They've fobbed off the local government and they've fobbed off the local community, saying, we don't have to talk to you, so therefore we won't. And I think that's been backed up by government generally.
That's what a 50-seat majority does, unfortunately.
So, Nathan, you've put together a plan here to seek the input of the community. Why is it important to hear directly from the Northeast community?
Look, over the next month, we know that there's going to be a lot of key decision makers visiting the state. And we want to make sure that when we're talking to them, we're not just talking from the view of our constituents and members and industry, but also getting a broader view from, be it, the local pub in Gladstone or the local high school, regional school in Winnaleah. What are the broader implications of this subsidised land scale, and what could it mean for that part of the state? Because we think it will result in lower opportunities for the region, and one must really question who will benefit. Will it be the federal government in terms of taxes collected from the activity on this land? Well, we're concerned possibly not. We understand that the potential purchaser has tax residency status in Ireland, of all places.
So that's a bit like a big tech sending the money to Ireland and then minimising their tax, so none of that comes back to the Australian government?
Absolutely, or less.
Outrageous.
Will job opportunities in the area increase? Almost definitely not. And then what impact does that actually have from a declining population perspective on the Northeast, which, Neil knows better than anyone, hasn't been in great shape for some time.
No, not since 2003, which was that perfect storm of the vegetable processors closing and sawmills closing. The thing about, there's a lot of intangibles around Rushy Lagoon for people in the northeast, where it is that one of those properties which signal to the northeast that they can be very productive. It was when Bert Farquhar really converted that farm to being pretty much dry open grazing to intensive agriculture through his use of really innovative irrigation. Like he irrigated the whole lot through gravity, off Mount Cameron Creek and a few of those other creeks through there. Oh man, pardon me. And Hewitt Tucker cleared it all with two HD10 bulldozers, a chain and a log between the two. Hewitt wanted to clear it. He only had one bulldozer and you can't do much with one. So he said to the old man, do you want to come in? And the old man could only afford half a bulldozer, so him and Hewitt went halvers in the other one, and away they went, which is Hewitt Tucker is John Tucker's grandfather from the East Coast. But what it signals to the northeast is that, here's a patch of very hungry ground which has been converted into something really productive to the point now where you've got 3 dairy farms on it. So it's more than just government interference in the good and honest way that business is done. It's more than just, the fingers of government interfering in what we do. The northeast feels really strongly about Rushy Lagoon and that it should be productive farmland in the nature of which it was developed, that it shouldn't go into pines, it shouldn't go into all these other things, because it's sort of one of those real examples of northeast resilience and having a go in quite difficult circumstances, and it'll be another really big kick in the guts for the northeast if it was to go down the way we hope it's not going.
I just love the smell of hypocrisy in the morning.
Is it like napalm?
Pretty much. We've just come through a budget where the federal government is getting rid of negative gearing because they believe it's a subsidy that skews the playing field for first home buyers. What we're seeing here is a subsidy that's skewing the playing field, making it very much out of level for the agricultural community. And the hypocrisy that's just staring us in the face on that one, I just can't believe it is that government, but I just can't believe they'd be pulling this sort of stunt around such a budget.
Have we heard from the local Labor federal member for Bass on the Rushy Lagoon issue?
No, very little, if I'm honest. But that seems to be the theme from the current Labor government in general. So, yeah, I guess everyone's just playing by the same directive at the moment.
There is a political line that I just want to clear up. We had a lot of people come through AgFest, Nathan Cox. It was actually quite impressive. But one said if you could grow a tree, you could grow grass. The other line has been, well, actually, this is not really productive land. This is actually productive land, isn't it? We can clear the deck. Anyone who says otherwise has probably got the wrong end of the stick.
You can't run successful dairies. That's a point of argument depending on where you sit, but those dairies have been there a long time and they've produced a lot of milk. You can't run dairies that'll do that on poor ground. And I know that the Federal Minister for Ag made some claims in relation to land classification. Land classification is a subjective thing. What you do with that ground is an objective thing. And Bert Farquhar, for example, knew that ground would produce. You just treat it differently to the ground around Sassafras and Kindred and along the northwest coast. Is different ground, but it's still productive, and the land price reflects that, and it reflects the sort of production and productivity and efficiency you can get out of it. It's pretty obvious that ground will do something, some of it better than others, but to rate it as unproductive and only fit for trees is just garbage.
It is, and I mean, it's as Nathan said, it's a huge property. Like, it's a big chunk of land, and yep, there's some pretty ordinary ground on there, and some of that's probably better off going back from where it started, particularly down on the river, particularly in some of those Ramsar wetlands and so on, along the Ringarooma River down through Black Duck Marsh and so on. But some of that other country's been really productive dairy farming since, I think, about 1998. I know when I was teaching up the northeast and working at Mount Cameron, which is just up behind Rushy, that was when those 3 dairies first started out there, and they've been very productive. A lot of milk have come off Rushy, and it's generated a lot of income, but a lot of community spirit too. Like Gladstone in particular. I mean, Gladstone initially started as a tin mining town. Now it's it's a dairy town and a bit of a tourist town, which is where you pick up your can of Coke on your way to Anson's Bay.
Well, you did mention the Federal Minister for Agriculture, and in terms of Gresham, was then asked on the Country Hour at AgFest, should prime agricultural land be planted out to pine trees and subsidised with taxpayers' money? Now, her answer was that the planning and land use decisions are largely matters for the state and local governments, and that some states do restrict and protect prime agricultural land. Does that put the responsibility back on the Tasmanian state government to explain how land like Rushy is classified and protected?
I think she's working off a false premise. Like, do you have to go and talk to your council if you want to change from growing potatoes to growing trees?
No, and again, land classification, it's a blanket thing that's thrown over an area, and I know there's areas that are classified as very low class ground that are still growing potatoes and all kinds of crops, and there's really good ground that is being used for low intensity grazing because of who's owned it or what the aspirations are of the owners. I think to blame any of this on land classification, particularly seeing how productive Rushy's been in the past, given the last, say, 15 years of very little TLC, I think that was just misinformed, and it was a really, really poor choice of words, and
I think
it was just stupid.
I think it's just poor advice.
To be honest, I think it's just diversion from the fact that the government here really is, driving, this purchase and conversion. If anybody in the open market wanted to buy that property and plant it out with trees, there is nothing stopping them from doing it. And that's good. People that buy land with their own money, make an informed investment decision about how they're going to use that land, should be able to do that. The problem here is that there's a government subsidy that's distorting the market, and it's meaning that other local purchasers, are being outbid, and that is where we're setting ourselves up for a market failure. That is the problem, and that is completely being driven by the federal government at this time. So to duck shove the issue back to state and local government as their issue that they've somehow created, I just think shows the government's colour in the fact that they're not willing to stand in front of it and explain it to people.
You would hope it's misinformed rather than being deceptive, but
it smells like deception.
It does, doesn't it?
Well, I'm just an average taxpayer, and I do like Australia. I just can't understand how.
I'm pleased about that.
How would you give money? And in the developing of this business case, someone is using taxpayers' money from a foreign organisation to buy land in Australia. I mean, it doesn't matter what sort of framework, legislatively or regulatory framework you put around this to try and make it good. As you say, Nathan, it really does stink. It doesn't pass the pub test,
so
to my mind.
Just on that, Grayson, I think, and I know most farmers would understand that foreign investment drives Australian agriculture, particularly Tasmanian agriculture, with our processing companies and corporations and pension funds that have really made our agriculture industry just a shining light. The issue here is this has all been driven by the ideology or the theology of the net zero movement. And if Gresham came in, as Nathan said, and bought it and planted trees on it, market value, won the bid.
It's good. That would be good.
That's fine. We stand by everyone's right to farm and to purchase and make informed business decisions. In this case, what we're seeing is it doesn't matter if it was Australian or someone else or a foreign business being subsidised to buy it. The carbon credit units, there's no guarantee they will stay in Australia. There's no guarantee much of the tax will stay in Australia, and we lose it would be apparent that we would lose the beef and the milk from Rushy that's currently being produced.
And it's it's all smoke and mirrors too around the carbon credits and so on, because if you're really interested in reducing emissions and absorbing carbon, there's more, the amount of trees you will put in at Rushy Lagoon to do that is just a drop in the ocean compared to what our native forest estate does in the over 40% of Tasmania, which is reserved in forest. Like down the southwest is one of the great carbon sinks of the globe. And that's why Tasmania is positive in terms of carbon emissions, because of our native forest estate. Just tinkering around the edges at Rushy Lagoon will make no difference at all to any net zero outcomes. It is all about using other people's money for carbon credits and that really complex financial instruments around that. And I mean, if someone wants to use their own money and go to Rushy and grow pine trees, they've got every right to go broke on their own, but they shouldn't have to have government assistance to do so.
Well, I'm sure those carbon credits will help the airlines get politicians to Germany to look at light rail, Neil.
Oh, and cycling in Bonn.
So there'd be nothing wrong with that idea. Let's wrap it up.
Sorry for those listening, scratching their head where that came from. It's an oblique reference to an exchange Peg Putt and I had on the Friday forum on the ABC last week, where Peg was waxing lyrical about all the good things they do in Europe, and she'd flown over there a number of times to have a look. Sort of, when you talk about hypocrisy, there we are.
Yeah, you can't fly anywhere and not have carbon emissions, I'm afraid. Anyway, let's wrap it up. Nathan Cowman, we've discussed a lot today, but what else is keeping you up at night?
I mean, I always like to have that big, long-term view to, enable us to do what we need to do for members. And I think, we understand a little bit more about where the federal government's heading after last week's budget announcements, but it'll be really nice, I think, to understand where the state government is at the end of this week. Like, I think that does then set us up for, what do we do for the year ahead to make sure that agriculture isn't left behind.
So really seeing the ag strategy coming to the fore?
Yeah, I mean, we should be able to see in this week's budget how the state government is going to bring the ag strategy to life. What I'd love to see in there, to be honest, is some sort of a vision around how we are going to put, downward pressure on all the various input costs for farmers in the state. And I think local government review would be a great place to start there, because there's some low-hanging fruit.
Oh, what a terrific idea, Nathan. Nathan Cox, what's triggering you at night and keeping you awake? Political promises, or
no, not political promises. Something a little bit closer to home, and that is simply commodity pricing. So 12 months ago, Ian Saw, previous president, did some work on comparing food prices in the UK compared to Launceston, and we found that on quite a swathe of food products, Launceston was more expensive than London, and he's redone it, and it's still the same. The interesting thing is I've kept an eye on some of those prices, and we see Australian beef over there anywhere between 50 to 90 pounds a kilo. So roughly double, so that's $100 to $180 a kilo over there. And we're seeing UK beef at over $200 a kilo, £105 a kilo. If you look across the globe, the US, Europe, UK, we are seeing those commodity prices for beef and other products completely out of step with ours. And I'm not saying we need, our local food price to be that high. It's just that somewhere in the middle, the farm gate price just gets lost. And I think the world is chasing protein, it's chasing good quality food. We produce it here, and I just have laid awake, if you want to put it like that, going, where's those missing dollars? Why aren't we seeing the returns come back to farmers? I mean, that's been the eternal question since farmers took something to a market. You didn't quite get enough for it as much for it as you'd like. But when there's such a disparity, you see Australian beef in the UK from 50 to 90 pounds. We're missing out somewhere, and I don't know that you can fix it, but it's a concern we are missing out.
Neil, my wife says potatoes have gone from $6 to $10. Is that a clue to what might be keeping you up at night?
Yeah, commodity, again, with what Nathan was saying, commodity prices, but at a more granular level as we start to work on price and contract for both the two major potato processors. I guess the thing that I guess is keeping me awake at night thinking about strategies of how we do this is getting a really strong and firm gross margin model for everything we do in farming and agriculture. So gross margin model has been the basis of negotiation for price and contract for Simplot and McCain over the years. Simplot have walked away from that. McCain seem to be strengthening their position around it. But and a couple of conversations with other vegetable growers that have taken the opportunity to call into TasFarmers and talk with us over the last few days has just reinforced the need for a really good, well-researched, professional gross margin model for agriculture, which is what we will do. And we will start talking to more and more producers, not just things that grow in the ground, but also the things that walk on top of it, so cattle, sheep, all the rest of it, around what a gross margin looks like, and then what is a sensible return on investment from that percentage. Because if you're in any other business apart from agriculture, you would work out what your business inputs are, what your return on investment should be. So for most businesses, 20, 25%, depending on the risk you're taking. And then that's your base. That's how you structure your business. In agriculture, we quite often don't have that because your return on investment can vary by the minute for some vegetable growers. Mm-hmm. If agriculture is truly to be this economic powerhouse for Tasmania, we've got to get that really solid gross margin underpinning it all, and that's where TasFarmers will have a strong role to play.
Well, that wraps it up. Thank you, Nathan Cowman, for your dulcet tones. Nathan Cox, always insightful. And Neil, a pleasure as always, and thanks for the good yarns and history lesson. To our members, you make it all happen. Thank you to you, and thank you to you, our listeners. Sponsors, TasBuilt, Telstra, and the Tas Farm Hub, thank you very much. And until after the state budget, we'll talk to you then. Have a good day. Bye.